Hey, good evening, everybody. It's me, Rocco, again. Thanks for coming back to the channel for another album review. Just got back from work and I'm just chilling out here in the backyard, as you guys can see. And earlier today, I was listening to Death Walks Behind You by Atomic Rooster, and I thought, this would be the perfect album to review tonight because I kind of take it upon myself as my responsibility as an album reviewer to kind of, oh, fuck, this fucking bug just landed on the table next to me. Let me just flick it off. Sorry, I don't know if I'm going to edit that out. But anyway, I take it upon myself as a music reviewer to kind of review those albums that kind of slip under the radar. Maybe they're not underrated per se. The people that do know about them really appreciate them. But for one reason or another, whether it be the band didn't really have the longevity or they never really made it big with the hit singles, it never really clicked with a wider audience. And I think that this album here is a prime example of one of those albums. It's a hidden gem. It's a fantastic album. Not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that, if you're a certain type of rock fan, if you love Deep Purple, bands like Lucifer's Friend, Black Sabbath, even Zeppelin, and if you like a little bit of that progressive rock edge, this is an album that you're gonna really love. And I really think more people should know about it. So, Atomic Rooster, a really obscure kind of band from the early 70s. They would later kind of get back together in the early 80s with a new wave of British heavy metal kind of sound. And bizarrely enough, in 2016, apparently, some weird formation of the band came back together, even though all the members are dead at this point. So I don't know how that worked out. But yeah, they're one of those bands I was talking about earlier that didn't really have the longevity. Like, their career really consisted of just short bursts, really 3 years, 69, 70, and 71, and maybe even 72, 73, where they were active. And then they kind of disbanded and then formed again in 80, 81, 82. So they didn't really have a long, 10, 12-year career that a lot of those other 70s bands had. And also, not many hit singles. They had maybe like one or two. So they really did slip under the radar, and none of their albums made it big. And also, the band was kind of plagued by lineup changes, and they couldn't really find a direction. They kept switching up styles and everything. But I really think with this album, they really nailed it. They nailed the early 70s hard rock sound with the heavy guitar playing, Hammond organ, and a little bit of craziness, a little dash of groovy kind of boogie woogie style music thrown in there as well, giving it this nice funky kind of edge. So really cool album, and again, something you're gonna love if you're into Sabbath, if you're into Deep Purple, bands like that. So yeah, interesting band. Now, as always, we're gonna talk about the history behind the album and then go into the overall review. And before I get into the review, I just want to give a huge shout out to the channel Sea of Tranquility, the host being Pete Pardo, one of my absolute favorite YouTube channels, and he is the one that totally got me into this album. So if you're watching, Pete, thank you very much. I appreciate the recommendation, and it was totally worth it. All right, guys. So for the history section of this review, the one thing you guys have to understand is that this band was created, and really the mastermind behind the whole thing is the keyboardist Vincent Crane. And Vincent Crane, he pretty much wrote all the material of the album. He's kind of the dictator of the band, really decided, when the band formed and dissolved and what musical direction they were going to be going in. And Atomic Rooster, they formed in 1969 by Vincent Crane. And this guy actually has a pretty tragic history. He suffered from bipolar disorder pretty much his entire life, which is just a terrible, terrible disease to have. And it went all the way back to 1969 when he was actually in the crazy world of Arthur Brown, a little bit of a more well-known band than Atomic Rooster. I'm sure if you guys are rock fans, you've heard of them. You've heard their song Fire, with all the psychedelia of the late 60s, with a little bit of a harder edge to it. And he was basically the keyboardist of the crazy world of Arthur Brown. But sadly, his bipolar disease got in the way. And in the middle of the tour, in the middle of their 69 tour, they had to really cancel it because he couldn't go on the way he was. And he got some help, and he recovered. But rather than going back into Arthur Brown, himself and Carl Palmer, the drummer of Arthur Brown, decided to break off and form a different band. And that became Atomic Rooster. And I bet you're wondering where the fuck they got the name Atomic Rooster, 'cause that's such an eccentric name for a band. And basically, like, it came from Chinese astrology. Every single year, is represented by kind of the Chinese zodiac sign. So, for example, I was born in the year of the rat, and apparently 69 was the year of the rooster. So, they called themselves the Roosters, and then they added the word atomic to it, I guess, just to give it some pizzazz. And yeah, so they formed the band. They got a Nick Graham on vocals and bass, and of course Carl Palmer was the drummer. And we all know Carl Palmer, obviously with his work in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, one of the biggest progressive rock bands of all time that he would later join. But at this point, it was like late '69. They formed Atomic Rooster, and funny enough, they didn't have a guitar player, so they went out, recorded their debut album, just simply called Atomic Rooster, and yeah, it was an album. I've heard a few songs. It's kind of, it really is lacking guitar. Sure, the organ and the piano playing takes prominence there, but without the guitar player, it kind of lacks like some balls to it. I don't know, maybe it's because I've heard this album first and then I went back and heard a few songs from the debut. But yeah, I don't know. It's okay, I guess. Nothing earth shattering. But then after they released their debut album, I think that was in early 1970, they just suddenly decided to get a guitar player. So they hired this dude, John Can, and later he would change his name to John Ducan for some strange reason. I don't give a that. Maybe he wanted to sound French for whatever fucked up reason. And yeah, so basically they re-recorded the album with overdubs. So John Ducan's guitar playing and vocals as well. And at this point, the bass player who was also the vocalist, Nick Graham, I keep forgetting the guy's fucking name. I don't think he went on to do anything major after the band. He left at the same time. So John Ducan took over vocals and they kind of overdubbed a few songs and basically re-released the album. But it still didn't really make any waves. So at this point, Carl Palmer, he was feeling that the band wasn't really going anywhere. And at the same time, he got recruited to ELP. So obviously he's going to quit Atomic Rooster and join ELP because, with names like Greg Lake and Keith Emerson, some of the greats, how can you resist? So he goes off, joins ELP, and the band kind of has to look for a new drummer. They find a guy named Paul Hammond, who, again, I don't think after this album he really went on to do anything major. But he's a pretty decent drummer, and he has some pretty solid moments on the album. So he joins the band, and they go into the studio to record their next album, Death Walks Behind You. And this album here, they definitely went for a heavier, darker edge. These guys must have definitely been listening to Sabbath, definitely listening to some Deep Purple, because this album here has that sinister edge, and again, with that combination of the heavy riffage and the Hammond organ sound. It's that classic early 70s sound that I freaking absolutely love. Bands like Deep Purple, Lucifer's Friend, Uriah Heep, and this band as well really nailed that interplay between the heavy guitar and the Hammond organ. I freaking love that. I wish more bands did that today. But again, it's that very early 70s thing that it was a product of its time, but it just sounds so fantastic, and it's a match made in heaven. And again, they really struck gold with this album. It's their most commercially successful album as well. And at the time of its release, it didn't really do anything. I think it went to number 11 on the charts. But later, in 1971, when the single of the album, Tomorrow Night, that's it, went to number 12 on the charts as well. So I guess when that single peaked, the album peaked as well. But again, it didn't really make huge waves. And then after this album, Vincent Crane really kind of fucked over John Ducan. The next album there, he really, fuck, these bugs keep, I might have to go inside later, guys. These bugs keep falling next to me. Okay, it's gone. Oh, fuck, I lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Oh yeah, they were fucking over John Ducan because when it was time to record their next album, Vincent Crane made it very clear that he was looking for a replacement for John Ducan in the vocal department. And he thought John Ducan, didn't really have the most powerful voice. And I agree with that. The vocals on this album aren't perfect. But it must have been really disheartening for Ducan, who, again, came from a background where he was singing and playing guitar. And to the point where he came into this new band, Atomic Rooster. They freaking re-released their debut album with his vocals overdubbed. So, again, this guy probably had the impression that his vocals were there to stay. And then all of a sudden, Vincent Crane is just saying, we're getting a new singer. Like, you could stay in the band and play guitar, but my whole intention was to get you on guitar and then have a more powerful singer. So that already kind of pissed him off, but he kind of went with the flow for a while. But then he realized that Vincent Crane was kind of lowering the mix of his guitar, or lowering the sound of his guitar in the mix and overdubbing certain parts, and just fucking around with his performance. So John Ducan didn't want to have any part of that shit, so he left the band. And they got a replacement. I think John Farlow was his name, I believe. And I can't really remember the exact names of the members of the band following this point. But the next album was also pretty good. In Hearing of, I hear that's a good album. It's called In Hearing of Atomic Rooster. People tell me it's a good album, and I should probably listen to it. But yeah, and then after that, they would release a couple more in the '70s. But again, it was a few years since like their big hit single, or I call it a big hit single, but their number 11 single with Tomorrow Night that came off of this album, and their record label wasn't really reaping the rewards of this band, so they decided to drop them. And then shortly after, I think by '73 or '74. Vincent Crane decided to dissolve the band, and all the members went their separate ways, did different things. And then, funny enough, in 1980, Vincent Crane decided to reform the band. He reconciled with John Ducan, of all people, so he came back, and they made a few albums in the early '80s, again dissolving. And funny enough, I found this hilarious. David Gilmour, of all people, made a guest appearance on one of their like early '80s albums. Go figure. I mean, one of the biggest names in guitar, playing with one of the most obscure bands of all time at the nadir of their career. I mean, after they were dropped by their label, reforming, you can't get any lower than that. And then eventually the label dropped them again, and that was pretty much the end of Atomic Rooster. Now, tragically, man, Vincent Crane, he must not have been getting good treatment for his bipolar, because in, I believe, 1989, he overdosed on some painkillers purposefully, ending his life tragically, and pretty much just ending any hope for the band reforming for the fans. And then I think in like the 90s or the 2000s, the other members passed away as well. The other members that appeared on this album, Paul Hammond and John Ducan. So really, death really walked behind these guys. I mean, they're all gone, sadly. And bizarrely enough, in 1969, what am I saying? In 2016, the band kind of reformed with like past members from other lineups. I don't fucking care. I'm not going to listen to that shit, because really, without Vincent Crane, there really is no Atomic Rooster. And that's pretty much the tragic and weird history behind this band. So, very interesting stuff, I would say. And the first thing that caught my eye behind this album was the album cover, which features the William Blake painting Nebuchadnezzar or whatever. And I remember this story from the Bible. It was pretty interesting. Just a king who basically morphed into like an animal or something, and it's just this really weird, sinister album cover that grabs your attention. And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people go towards this album versus their other few, which have some really strange and kind of funny album covers. But yeah, iconic album cover, I gotta say. So for that alone, get the album. But the music is just incredible as well. So without further ado, let's dive into the overall review. Alright, so Death Walks Behind You. Why do I consider this album a hidden gem? Well, first of all, it came out in the year 1970, which was really the earliest years of proto-metal or proto-hard rock, if you want to call it that. And all these influential bands were coming out at the time. Deep Purple with their amazing album, In Rock. Sabbath with their debut album. Lucifer's Friend, another very underrated band or underappreciated band that you guys all have to listen to if you love this kind of thing. And a few other bands as well. And Atomic Rooster were definitely part of that kind of category, at least for this album. Again, I mentioned they would go on to different territory. Apparently their album after their next was kind of soulful and things like that, so they kind of abandoned the whole hard rock atmosphere, but they really nailed it with this one, as I already said multiple times, with the hard rock, heavy Hammond organ sound, combined with the heavy rock guitar riffs of John Ducan. And the thing about this album is that, okay, compared to Sabbath's debut, compared to In Rock by Deep Purple, it's a little bit underwhelming. But, once you've heard those albums so many times, you want to hear something else similar. I mean, you want more of the same. And then you have to start going to the Tier 2 albums, which are fantastic, excellent albums, but just not quite masterpieces like those ones. And this one here definitely belongs in that category, but there really are no down points to this album. It's just excellent. And I bet you're thinking, like, what really sets this band apart from those other bands that were doing the heavy Hammond organ and combined with the hard rock guitar playing? Well, there's a few things. First of all, this band here, they have this like sinister sound on a couple tracks. Not all of the songs, but most notably the first song and the last song, which are both about 8 minutes in length. So again, a pretty sizable chunk of the album has this dark, ominous, sinister kind of sound that is more along the lines of Black Sabbath. So if you like that Black Sabbath kind of dirgy, doomy, slow-paced, sludgy kind of sound, those two tracks are really going to please you. And again, just sections of them, not the whole thing through and through, but you're going to notice a little bit of that there. And again, Sabbath's album came out many months before this one, again, in the same year. So they might have gotten some influence from that. You can't really rule that out, or they could have just been contemporaries. But a thing that really sets this band apart is they have this groove. They have this boogie kind of sound to their music. And I think that really comes from Vincent Crane's Hammond organ playing. The band really locks into these awesome grooves at points that, bands like Deep Purple, who are more, more in your face and bombastic, didn't really have. This band here just really gets into the pocket at points, really harkening back to like late 50s rock and roll. And again, if you hear this album for the first time, you might not agree with me, but listen to it multiple times and you'll start getting that vibe. That's just my opinion. But anyway, I think that kind of sets them apart from, Uriah Heep, which was more with the vocal harmonies and a little bit on the softer edge, the more psychedelic edge. And Deep Purple, which is just in-your-face, bombastic, virtuosic solos. This band here, when they do get into solo sections, they never really go over the edge. They never really are like virtuosic. And I think Vincent Crane, probably by far the most accomplished musician on the album. John Ducan has some awesome solos, some awesome riffs, but nothing really, that propels you over the edge and just makes you say, wow, listen to that shit. It's really just Vincent Crane doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But that being said, John Ducan definitely adds a lot to the band because that debut album didn't have the balls. It didn't have the edge. They really needed that heavy kind of distorted guitar to give it that extra something. So John Ducan definitely made a big difference to this album. And the drumming's pretty great as well. But yeah, the Hammond organ really does all the heavy lifting. And again, with Vincent Crane doing the songwriting, it's easy to see why. His piano playing as well is fantastic. I mean, this album isn't all heavy. There's a lot of softer, more melodic moments, especially on the second last track and the final song as well. Has some great piano melodies running through. So it isn't heavy from start to finish. There's a lot of variety interspaced and very, very memorable songs. I mean, you could really hum a lot of these tunes, especially the single Tomorrow Night. But a lot of them have these memorable hooks and catchy choruses, which is really cool. I really like that. Again, it has a few instrumentals. There's a song VUG, I don't know how you pronounce it, Vug or Voog or whatever. And again, the final track, which is this epic kind of 8-minute weird instrumental that give the album a lot of variety as well. Let the band really expand their horizons there and show you what they can do on their instruments. Pretty awesome highlights on the album, I would say. The instrumentals really hard, really heavy, and really out there, I would say. There's a lot of weird sections here. But for the most part, the songs with vocals are pretty straightforward and are pretty tight in structure. Which is what kind of surprises me about this album is that people call it progressive rock. And, I could see that here and there. I mean, they do wander off into some weird experimental instrumental sections. But I wouldn't really consider it progressive rock, in my opinion. There's no jazz influence. There isn't really much classical influence coming in here. They're not really combining genres and, having strange, eccentric song structures, with the exception of the final track. So I would consider this more of an early hard rock album with some psychedelia, some experimental edge to it, but I wouldn't really call it progressive rock. Feel free to disagree with me. It's just all a matter of opinion, honestly, how you categorize shit in different genres. But yeah, fantastic album. And, John Ducan's vocals, again, they aren't fantastic, but they kind of have this dark, deep, sinister edge to it, which fits a lot of the tracks. And you never really think to yourself, like, this is a crappy singer. You're just thinking, maybe doesn't have enough balls, doesn't have enough, not balls, what am I looking for? A little bit more showmanship, basically. Pretty much just sings a lot of the songs in the same key and or the same kind of tone, and doesn't really wander off into wow factor territory. But with Vincent Crane's fantastic Hammond organ playing, the heavy riffs, the catchy melodies, and kind of the boogie 50s rock and roll sound, you can't really go wrong with this album. It's incredible. And it's just solid from start to finish. There isn't one weak song on the album that I could think of. So it's just a really addictive, really enjoyable listen that you could just keep putting on and listening to over and over and over again. So a highly recommended album. Now let's briefly talk about this album track by track. Alright guys, so kicking off the album, we get the title track of Death Walks Behind You. And this track here, it's 7.5 minutes, and this song here is definitely making a statement. This one and the last track are probably the most unique tracks on the album, and this one here is definitely one of the doomiest tracks I've ever heard in my life. at this point in time. I think other than Sabbath's debut, this definitely has to be one of the greatest influences on doom metal, and with those heavy, distorted riffs, and just this whole sinister and ominous vibe behind the track is amazing. And the thing is, it's 7.5 minutes, but really the song just kind of goes through the motions with these two main sections that kind of juxtapose between each other. This really tense, doomy kind of section, and this kind of funky, groove-laden kind of section as well, which you wouldn't think would meld well together, but they do actually. They meld perfectly. And again, other than Sabbath, this one here is probably the doomiest. And but yeah, again, I wouldn't really consider this progressive rock because again, this track here, although it's 7.5 minutes, it really doesn't go through that many changes. It's really just those two themes kind of alternating. Sure, there is kind of a weird intro and a little chamber piano section in the middle that break up the action, but overall, it's a pretty straightforward track. But awesome, creating this sinister vibe. And you look at the album cover and you listen to this track, and it's just the perfect marriage of visual art and music. I mean, it's perfect. The intro, very, very strange intro, just starts off with this absolutely ominous piano playing, very sinister, just building this tension. And then before you know it, the guitar comes in, and it sounds very machine-like. It just comes in with this kind of cranking nature with the and again, the sense of tension that the band builds is absolutely incredible. I can only think of Sabbath as rivaling this. And before we know it, at the 1 minute mark, the whole band comes in and locks into that awesome groove, the bounce down. So kind of like anticlimactic after that tension-laden intro, but it really works and it really grooves. It's so easy to headbang to. Then before you know it, John Ducan joins in, and the vocals, yeah, they're pretty good, pretty deep and pretty sinister, so they kind of fit with the music, but nothing like awe-inspiring or anything like that. But and you get these cool backup vocals. Death walks behind you, do 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 do. Pretty cool stuff there. And then all of a sudden we get this really up-tempo riff cutting through, and now we get into the heavier section of the track that really, again, just builds the tension back up. And I really like John Ducan's vocals during this section of the song. It just builds that sinister kind of nature to it, and it's very ominous. Even the lyrics are like, "Close the door, shut the light, you'll be so afraid tonight." Just perfectly fits the music. And again, coming after that kind of funky section, kind of unexpected there. But then, then after that section, it gets back into the Death Walks Behind You theme, like the funky theme. Then it goes into that kind of piano interlude I was telling you guys about. Has this kind of laid back chamber vibe to it. So pretty cool, before kind of just rinsing and repeating those same themes throughout the rest of the 3 minutes of the track. So really good song, and I love that tension building John Ducan riff, that ding 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 ding. Just a really heavy, doomy song. Damn. So Death Walks Behind You. This is definitely the statement these guys were trying to make with this album, and although it's not my personal favorite on the album, I think this is probably the most important track, especially coming out in 1970, so early in the history of proto-metal. And this track here is probably the most influential on the album. So for that reason, I might give it a 9. In terms of just quality itself, it might be an 8.5, but let's just give it somewhere within that range. So an 8.5 to a 9 out of 10. Then we get to track 2, the instrumental VUG or VUG, or however the fuck you want to pronounce it. And this is a nice 5-minute groovy instrumental. The first of 2 instrumentals, I mentioned the last one is this 8-minute crazy extravaganza. This one is definitely one of the more conventional, or the most conventional instrumental on the album. And a really cool track as well. It really shows Vincent Crane's, late 50s boogie-woogie inspired keyboard playing and Hammond organ playing. And some awesome grooves here. I love how it starts off with this kind of whirlwind of organ, just really piquing your attention. It kind of sounds like this mad scientist at the organ, just going nuts. But then it locked into this pretty jazzy groove, and you get some chugging guitar in the background, giving it that ballsy edge, which is pretty awesome. And it's really groovy, really upbeat, and pretty soulful as well, I should mention. And then it alternates with kind of that intro again with the like the crazy tension-building madman intro of the song. But then before you know it, we get into this awesome Hammond organ solo by Vincent Crane. And this part here is by far my favorite part of the song. It's just this really conventional, like it's not really creative per se, but it's just a textbook example of just an awesome, you know, boogie woogie inspired organ solo with this distorted kind of edge to it, giving it the heaviness. And again, that chugging guitar in the background, really laying it down. Now, here's the problem with the song. We get into the guitar solo, and I feel that it's kind of low in the mix. It's a good guitar solo, nothing like absolutely fantastic, but I feel like the organ is still center stage, although the organ is kind of playing kind of the simple lines holding it down, and the guitar is really supposed to be the star of the show. So in my opinion, like, fucking Vincent Crane should have mixed John Buchan a bit higher in the mix, because it actually is a really good guitar solo, but I don't know, what are you going to do? So that lasts for a minute, but pretty awesome section there. And then the organ comes back in, does some kind of, kind of builds up back into the original theme of the track, and ends on a great note. So really cool, upbeat instrumental. So really good song. I would also give it an 8.5, just like the opening track. I wouldn't quite give it a 9. There's nothing really like special or extravagant about the track. It's just a solid instrumental. So great song. And good variety from the first tracks. The first track had that doomy, sinister vibe. This one here, nothing like that. But still has that heaviness with John Buchan's chugging riffs in the background. So, gotta love it. Alright guys, I had to come inside. Those bugs were just driving me nuts out there. Normally I'm okay with bugs, but they just kept fucking falling on my hair and shit. So, came indoors. So, without further ado, let's talk about the third track on the album. The hit single, if you can call it that. Tomorrow Night. And this one here, it's a pretty interesting song. It's about 4 minutes in length. Definitely probably the catchiest track on the album, the most accessible, and the least heavy, but there are some heavy elements, as we'll get to later on in the song. But for the most part, it's just this really almost funky piano and guitar groove that's laid down, and with the cowbell in the background, really gives it that poppy, accessible feel. The verses are kind of clunky, and they're kind of simplistic, especially from what came before with that instrumental extravaganza we just went through. But it's pretty cool, and we do get a cool organ solo in the middle, very bluesy, very gospel-like as well, so not really going off into a crazy prog territory, as some people would claim this album is. And later on in the track, we even get a guitar solo that kind of like sneaks its way in, and it kind of brings in the little touch of heaviness that this album had before into the mix. As well as the final moments of the song, which is just this weird kind of atonal guitar shredding that just kicks in, and the song suddenly stops, and we get this weird John Buchan guitar playing that kind of brings the avant-garde experimental edge to the song. So I don't know if that was edited out for the single release, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because it's just this weird thing that doesn't really fit in with the rest of the track. But I enjoy it. On first listen, I thought, this song was kind of throwaway, but after repeated listens, it kind of just eats away into your mind, and it's extremely catchy. So I'm going to give it a strong 8 out of 10. Not a masterpiece or anything, and definitely the weakest song on the album for me, but still a pretty solid track, and I could see why this would have been accessible to the masses. So good track. So coming up next on the album, we get 7 Lonely Streets, which is a big favorite of mine on the album. Honestly, if not the best song, then probably like the second best song on the album. This is absolutely fantastic. And again, if you're a Deep Purple fan, you're going to really dig this track, because there's this amazing guitar and Hammond organ kind of trade-off solo in the middle of the song, or battle, if you prefer that term, which really harkens back to what Deep Purple were doing at the time between John Lord and Ritchie Blackmore. Of course, second tier, it's not as, explosive and, virtuosic as them, but it just has that awesome feel to it. And I must say, guys, Paul Hammond on this song, he's absolutely bashing the fuck out of these drums. I mean, he gives a really powerful drumming performance here, and his fills are intricate and heavy. That's what I love about the song. It's another very heavy track, and Buchan plays one of the most memorable riffs on the whole album with the bow now 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 down now now now. It's such a memorable, groovy, and heavy riff at the same time. Really memorable. Everything about this song just fits perfectly. And I love how it starts off with kind of this false intro with this kind of church organ set up by Vincent Crane. It sounds really great, really powerful melody, really melodic. But then before you know it, John Buchan comes in with his harsh, distorted riffs, and the song kicks into the main riff of the song. At one point, there's this cool stop and start guitar riff section with the organ just blazing in the background before getting into the first verse. And when we get into the verses, this is probably my only criticism of the song. And, it's a pretty major one, but I really do feel that the vocals are buried in the mix. And I think that if they lifted John Ducan's vocals to the forefront, it would be a lot more powerful. But alas, that's what we get. I don't know what Vincent Crane had against John Ducan, honestly. But yeah, the verses are pretty cool. We get this kind of weird, kind of uplifting organ melody in the background, but the song still has a sinister vibe somehow. I don't really know how that works. I think it's John Ducan's just manic vocals on the song, and it's a great melody, and it repeats itself, but then it gets really intense. The part where he sings "I'm all alone," and the organ's getting really climactic and sinister, as opposed to the kind of more uplifting organ during the verses. The drumming in the background is just absolutely crazy. Then we get into that organ and guitar trade-off I was talking about, which was really cool. And at one point they join forces into this one awesome riff, and then the guitar comes in, kind of takes center stage for a bit. Again, that drumming, hell yeah! Before breaking into the main melody, and I also like the outro of the song. It kind of reprises the intro with that kind of church organ thing, but here we got the guitar really doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. And it's just a really climactic way to end the track, giving it that epic feel. So again, one of the better songs on the album, almost 7 minutes in length. But again, I wouldn't really call it a prog rock song, because it does kind of just, keep those two main components of the track, the verses and then the intense chorus, along with the memorable riff, with a little solo section in the middle. So again, but great tune. I would easily give this a 9 out of 10. On bad days, I would give it an 8.5, but today I'm definitely feeling a 9 out of 10. So the next track here, Sleepin' for Years, it definitely keeps up the momentum from the previous song. This is another one of the big highlights and another one of the harder hitting songs on the album. You gotta love the opening of this track. I mean, it's just instantaneous what it reminds you of. It's obvious. Iron Man. This track here has this really, really ominous intro with this droning guitar that sounds almost exactly like the weird, haunting intro of the Black Sabbath song Iron Man. And what I find absolutely crazy about this whole thing is that this album here and Paranoid, which featured the song Iron Man, came out in the same month of the same year, September 1970, and they were both recorded in the summer of 1970. So really, it's probably just one of the craziest coincidences in rock history that these two mammoth albums came out at the same time and featured very, very similar intros. I really don't think that Atomic Rooster had heard the Iron Man intro up to this point, and vice versa. So it's just really one of those kind of serendipitous events in music history where two things were coming out at the same time that just happened to sound extremely similar. So I don't know, that just boggles my mind every time. And for the longest time, I thought Paranoid came out after this album, but then I looked it up. They both came out in September 1970. So crazy coincidence if I ever heard one. But yeah, this section of the song here is just crazy. And again, this is the very experimental side of the band. Again, it's very kind of dissonant and sinister and haunting, kind of harkening back to the opening track, keeping that dark, ominous theme that was kind of lost on the previous few songs, but here it's back full force. So that lasts for about a minute, and you really don't know what's going to happen. But then all of a sudden, the song bursts. It's this awesome guitar lick that, again, I'm going to make another comparison. Sounds like the very beginning of Jimmy Page's solo on Whole Lotta Love. That's what it reminds me of. But then we get the main riff of the song coming in, which again is very heavy, very chugging and memorable. The like very simple, but just so memorable. And it's like, it makes you think, like, how did no one come up with this riff yet? It's awesome. And the organ joins in the background. Really cool stuff. Great melody on the vocals. And I love when the song kind of kicks into high gear with that vocal melody. Staying around far too long. That part there is really cool and really catchy as well. And I love the unison between the guitar and the Hammond organ on that section. I don't really know how to describe it. It's just this weird kind of, I don't know, more up-tempo section compared to like the start of the track. But really memorable and really catchy there. And for me, what really steals the show is John Ducan's guitar solo, which again is kind of buried in the mix. We get this heavy Hammond organ riff, unison with the guitar, with the that kind of like goes over the entire guitar solo. And the guitar itself, the guitar solo is kind of underneath that rather than being on top of the riff. So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. Normally, you'd expect this crazy solo to be going over an underlying riff, but here it's the other way around. But if you listen carefully, this guitar solo is really intense and really heavy as well. And it goes on for quite a long time. So it's kind of John Ducan's showcase moment on the album, in my humble opinion. But really cool stuff. Then it locks back into the main riff seamlessly. That's a great transition there, if you guys notice that. And the song kind of just closes out with, how it started. So again, a much heavier song, a much darker song than what came before. But for the most part, it's a pretty catchy tune with some awesome riffs and a great solo. So this track here, I would easily give it an 8.5, maybe even sometimes a 9 out of 10. So very similar in quality to the song that came before it. Excellent track. The next track here is a really good one for me, guys. I Can't Take No More. This is just a cool 3-minute groovy track on the album. Isn't as heavy or bombastic as the previous few, but really gets the job done, and a very catchy song as well. Now, I hate to keep making comparisons with other bands, but I can't help it. The main riff of this track sounds, to me, to my ears, exactly like the main riff of Don't Bring Me Down by Electric Light Orchestra. You know, the it's almost exactly the same. And honestly, it probably is a coincidence. I can't picture, Jeff Lynne of ELO really getting into Atomic Rooster. Again, I don't know. Who knows? But definitely sounds exactly the same as that riff. And yeah, it's just a really pumping, groovy riff. There's even some like slide guitar playing in the background. Giving it this bluesy edge. And overall, this song is probably the bluesiest on the album, the most blues inspired, but has an awesome groove to it. I love the little organ licks that come in and separate the verses of the track, giving it this this nice kind of laid back feel in between those verses. But it does pick up the intensity with this guitar riff that comes in, the and then the organ riff, and there's even like a twin guitar part at some points, it sounds like, at least to me anyway. And John Ducan's vocals are pretty intense at one point where he's singing take take, that section there. Pretty cool. Closes off with a guitar solo. Just a really fun, thumping, bluesy song. In terms of a rating, I'd give this an 8.5 out of 10. I really enjoy this one. Coming up next, we get another excellent song, Nobody Else. If you can call one song the ballad of the album, this would definitely be the one. It's just a beautiful song, a really melancholic one. And the lyrics are really meaningful as well, especially in the context of, Vincent Crane's bipolar disorder, with lyrics like "My whole world is falling down" and "My whole world is so alone." You could really, you really feel like the emotion and the sincerity behind those lyrics. Again, without having that background, this is just going to sound like a depressing ballad, but with that background, it just takes on a whole new character and really makes the song that much more enjoyable. But yeah, it's a really cool track, and it has this unexpected tempo change in the middle, which we'll get to after. But basically, it starts off with this beautiful, it actually starts off with this annoying chant that just opens the track. It has nothing to do with the rest of the song, and it's just so annoying and so unnecessary and grating on the ears, with the whole band just chanting this random thing. It only lasts 15 seconds, so it's not a big deal, but I don't know why they would put that in there. Anyway, that's my one and only criticism of the track. But really, it starts with this beautiful, melancholic, almost like chamber jazz piano intro, and the guitar just gradually joins in the background, just playing very restrained melodic lines there, which are really good. And then when the vocals kick in at the 1 minute 20-second mark, we get into those emotional lyrics. But then, I think about 2.5 minutes in, the song just suddenly switches tempo. And I guess that's what Vincent Crane was really going for at the end of the day, like just a musical embodiment of how you feel with bipolar disorder. So obviously with that disease, you feel like absolute shit in the deepest depressions. But then all of a sudden, just like that, you could switch to this mania or this euphoria, which I really think is represented by the middle section of the song. So in that sense, it's a really powerful song, really artistic statement here. And I absolutely love this section of the track. We got the piano still going in the background, rather than the organ, which had been featured throughout most of the album, which is interesting because you got the piano, and then the guitar comes in, and I love this guitar playing. It's multi-tracked. We got John Ducan's kind of bluesy riff kind of playing in the background with the and then over that he's soloing and the piano's still going in the background. It's just this nice kind of up-tempo, uplifting section of the track. And probably like a big highlight of the album. That one little like 1 minute section there, it's just awesome. But then before you know it, it all comes crashing to a close, and that piano melody comes back in, ending the song off quite beautifully, if you ask me. So, really cool song with that unexpected change in the middle, really emotional and melancholic. I definitely see where the band was going with this one, and I would give it a very strong 8.5 out of 10. It's a very nice change of pace on the album. Then finally, we get to the last track on the album, the absolutely insane, eccentric, epic instrumental Gershatzer. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right. One of the craziest song titles I ever heard in my life. No idea what it means, so don't even ask. I tried looking it up. This track here is just really a showcase for Vincent Crane and Paul Hammond to really show what they can do on their instruments, respectively. And it's a really bombastic, crazy, just all over the place instrumental that really takes a lot of time to get into. For me, a lot of these tracks were immediate. I liked them on first listen, and they didn't really grow on me a lot with multiple listens, but this track here is a major exception because there's just so much going on and there's so many unexpected changes, goes through so many different styles and moods, from boogie woogie 50s rock all the way into just experimental avant-garde distortion. It just covers so much ground, and it's really a song that takes multiple listens to fully absorb, and probably the most progressive song on the album, if you want to consider all the different styles being combined and the tempo changes. I would definitely call this a prog rock tune. But again, it's not enough to make the whole album a prog rock album like people consider it. But yeah, awesome track. I love the main riff of the song, the main theme on the organ that gets reprised multiple times throughout the track, breaking up the lengthy instrumental sections. It's just so jovial, and it has that late 50s boogie kind of style groove to it. Even little touches of jazz with the rapid fire drumming in the background. Awesome. Some like nice guitar riffs going on in the background. And I love how it repeats the second time with a little bit more intensity. Just awesome intro there. But it really doesn't prepare you for what this song has to offer, because then all of a sudden, at the 1 minute 18-second mark, Vincent Crane comes in with this rapid fire, again, very 50s inspired rock, rapid fire piano solo. Kind of sounds like a lot like Elton John, like a lot of Elton John's, rock and keyboard solos there. Very cool. Then the organ comes back and it's all distorted and crazy, and we get this mini like organ solo, and you're fucking like, what the hell's gonna happen next? And I'll tell you what happens next. All of a sudden, at the 2 minute mark, we get something very special on the album that we hadn't really heard so far. A classical piano solo. And it's really memorable. I mean, this is a really memorable melodic piano solo, and I love how the organ in the background has this hollow kind of like bell-like sound to it that really accentuates that. I just really enjoy that section, and it's something we hadn't really heard on the album so far. And I love classical piano when it's incorporated into rock there. So, awesome section of the track. Then at the 3 minute mark, here's where all shit hits the fan. It already hit the fan, but more shit hits the fan here. We get into the craziest organ solo I've ever heard in my life. It is the most heavily distorted, avant-garde, ominous, sinister organ solo you'll ever hear, and it lasts a good 1.5 minutes at least. And again, it has that creepy, weird atmosphere that the title track really opened up with, and was continued with Sleeping for Years for a bit there. So really tying in that creepy theme, and it gets really weird and really disjointed, and almost doesn't even sound like an organ. It's almost unrecognizable. I gotta be honest, guys. Like, when I first heard this song, I was absolutely blown away and amazed by how crazy and distorted this organ sounded. I mean, words cannot describe it. Just go and listen to it. It's just unrecognizable. Then out of that chaos, the main riff comes back in, and that's kind of a great moment of tension and release there on the album. After that just crazy avant-garde section, it was nice to get back into that kind of boogie swinging riff. That's another word I would use to describe it. Like, it has this swing to it, this jazzy swing. And then kind of like we're in the later half of the song, I'd say like the last third of the track, the drums really take over. Paul Hammond comes in with a lengthy 2 minute drum solo. And at first, I'm like, this might be a little bit too long. I'm not a huge fan of drum solos, especially on studio albums, on live albums and everything. Like, that's fine. But over time, I've come to really appreciate this solo. It's very dynamic, and it locks into some awesome grooves at points there. So really interesting solo. And then when that's all over, the main theme comes back in again, and the song really comes to a bang. So yeah, really awesome song. I really think Vincent Crane steals the show on this song and this album in general. The song here didn't really have much guitar playing like it did during the main parts with the riffs in the background, but it's really a keyboard showcase here. Going through all the freaking styles. I mean, classical, experimental, avant-garde, boogie, rock and roll. It's all over the place, and a great drum solo to boot. So Gershatzer, probably my favorite track on the album. Definitely between this and what's that track called now? How am I forgetting it now? Seven Lonely Streets. Even the title track is close up there. All the songs are just, the quality on this album is just extremely consistent. And I think I got a little carried away describing that last track there, because I really am pretty passionate about it. It's just an excellent instrumental. And maybe it's the prog fan within, because again, this is by far the proggiest song on the album. But yeah, so in conclusion, guys, I don't think I got much more to say about this album. If you've heard the review, you've heard what I had to say about it. It's just, I would say it's an essential album for any like early 70s hard rock fan. And again, it's one of those second tier albums that really don't quite reach the same mark as Deep Purple's In Rock and Led Zeppelin's first few albums, and so on and so forth. But there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, not everything has to be an absolute masterpiece. This is just an awesome album from start to finish, way, way above average. I mean, this is just, like, don't get the impression that I'm saying this is just like, one of those just okay albums. This is a great album, and don't hesitate to buy it or stream it or whatever the fuck you want to do. And yeah, so comment below on your opinion. Are there better Atomic Rooster albums? Am I underrating the debut album from those few tracks I heard? Let me know. And of course, guys, I always appreciate you watching the videos. And take care, and as always, rock on.